The screen flickers with the sterile glow of studio lights, bathing the set in a polished sheen that masks the storm beneath. The logo of a primetime cable network spins on the lower third, promising yet another night of commentary. Yet this night feels different. The stage has been set for confrontation. On one side, Kellyanne Conway, the seasoned strategist, a master manipulator of narratives, her posture sharp, her voice already vibrating with the intensity of someone who has spent decades controlling the room. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, seated with an almost disarming composure, her hands folded, her gaze steady, a calm fire behind her eyes. The host's introduction barely finishes before Kellyanne surges forward with words sharpened, like arrows. This country is sick of witch hunts, sick of media bias, sick of these endless partisan theatrics that serve no one. Her voice slices through the studio, a familiar cadence of deflection and defiance. She leans toward the camera, gesturing with hands that cut the air, trying to seize not only the conversation but the nation's attention. Every syllable carries echoes of the Trump White House, rapid, aggressive, calculated to overwhelm. Jasmine does not move. She sits, a stillness so deliberate it becomes its own weapon. Her silence is not empty. It is charged, pressing down heavier than Kellyanne's thunder. The audience watching at home feels the imbalance. One woman battling to dominate with noise, the other commanding with restraint. The host tries to steer the conversation, but Kellyanne barrels forward, listing grievances like ammunition fired, without pause. You call it accountability, but the American people see it for what it is: persecution, hypocrisy, and political theater. She points across the table, the camera catching the flare in her eyes. And Congresswoman Crockett is right at the center of it. For a moment, the room seems suspended, waiting. Jasmine lifts her head slowly, her expression unbroken, the barest curve of a smile flickering, as though she's heard this song before. She leans just slightly toward the microphone, her tone measured, almost surgical. You can repeat the same lines, but repetition doesn't turn deflection into truth. The words land like a blade, drawn in silence. The studio stills. The host glances nervously at the control booth, sensing what the millions at home are already feeling. This is no ordinary political spat. This is an ideological collision. Kellyanne scoffs, shaking her head. But the sound betrays something beneath. The edge of unraveling. The veneer of confidence that carried her through countless interviews seems thinner now, strained. Crockett does not press. She lets the weight of her line linger, lets the silence after it stretch until it becomes unbearable. On Twitter, on TikTok, on countless live feeds, viewers are already clipping the moment. The phrase begins its rapid migration, torn from the studio and launched into the bloodstream of digital discourse. The clash is no longer just happening under bright studio lights. It is happening everywhere. In living rooms, in bars, in college dorms, in the restless scroll of millions of thumbs across screens. A woman built on spin and spectacle has met her match in a woman rooted in clarity and composure. Two eras of politics collide in front of a nation desperate for truth. When Kellyanne's voice finally breaks, higher pitched now, tinged with frustration, Jasmine doesn't need to shout. She doesn't even raise her voice. She just waits, then lets her words glide through the chaos. Loud doesn't mean right. It is the scalpel against the storm. And in that moment, the debate becomes something more than television. It becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the women seated across from each other but the fractured soul of a nation itself. The camera angle shifts, catching the sharp outline of Kellyanne Conway's face under the relentless studio lights. She has been here countless times before. For years this has been her battlefield. The polished set, the glaring lights, the countdown clock in her ear. She thrives in chaos, drawing strength from it, bending disorder into advantage. Tonight, she tries to summon that same energy, the old rhythm of survival through spectacle. Her words come rapid fire, each syllable a weapon. This Congresswoman doesn't represent accountability. She represents political vengeance. These hearings, these investigations, this entire circus, it's a waste of the American people's time. She leans forward, stabbing the air with her index finger, her voice rising like a sermon delivered in anger. The cadence is unmistakable, rehearsed deflection dressed as conviction. Viewers at home know this tone. It carried her through the firestorms of 2016, through the unrelenting questions about scandals, ethics, and the infamous phrase she once uttered, alternative facts. But this time the armor looks thinner. Jasmine watches with a calm stillness, jotting notes on her pad as Kellyanne floods the room with sound. The Congresswoman knows the tactic. It's classic Conway. Create noise so dense the truth gets lost. Inside it. The strategy is not to answer, but to overwhelm. Kellyanne pivots, weaving from one grievance to another. One moment it's media bias, the next it's partisan witch hunts. How many times, she snaps, are we going to put the same people on trial in the court of public opinion? If the Democrats spent half as much time fixing this country as they do attacking political opponents, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. Her voice trembles, not with nerves but with the strain of constant escalation. The camera cuts briefly to Jasmine, who sits in striking contrast, unmoved, her composure radiating power in its restraint. The host attempts to rein Kellyanne back to the topic at hand, but she cuts him off. No, let me finish. People deserve to hear the truth. What's happening here is not justice, it's harassment. Jasmine finally looks up, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Her silence has stretched to the breaking point. The audience can feel it. The tension of a coiled spring about to be released. Yet she waits still, letting Kellyanne's momentum collapse under its own weight. The strategy, once Conway's greatest weapon, now betrays her. What once felt like dominance begins to feel like desperation. The more she piles on, the less convincing it sounds. Her tempo quickens, her gestures sharper, as though volume and speed could compensate for the fragility of her argument. And the viewers at home see it. Social media erupts not with agreement, but with ridicule. Memes form in real time, mocking the contradictions and the fury. The same audience that once marveled at Conway's ability to bend narratives now senses the cracks. The chaos that once served her begins to look like collapse. At the table, Jasmine tilts her head slightly, a gesture so small yet so deliberate it slices through the moment. She leans forward just enough for her voice to carry clearly, not loudly, but with a controlled precision. You've had 4 minutes of uninterrupted time. You've listed grievances, not answers. Do you plan to offer facts or just noise? The studio chills. The host swallows, caught between two forces, sensing the balance shifting. Kellyanne stiffens, a flash of irritation across her face, but she doesn't immediately respond. For a fraction of a second, silence falls. Then, in that fragile pause, the audience feels it, the beginning of an unraveling. The tactics that once made Kellyanne untouchable are no longer landing. Her chaos, once calculated, now exposes her vulnerability. Jasmine's poise, sharpened through years of legal training and congressional battles, has turned silence into a weapon sharper than Conway's loudest roar. And as the cameras continue rolling, millions realize they are not witnessing a repeat of history. They are watching a shift. The slow dismantling of a once dominant force, undone not by louder chaos but by calm, unyielding precision. The nation leans closer. The storm has been unleashed. But in the stillness across the table lies something stronger, a quiet reckoning that has only just begun. The studio air feels heavy now, as though every molecule carries the static of confrontation. Kellyanne Conway sits rigid in her chair, her chest rising with sharp, uneven breaths. She has delivered her fusillade of accusations, her voice filling every corner of the broadcast. Yet the silence that follows belongs not to her, but to the woman across the table. Jasmine Crockett leans back, her pen resting lightly in her hand. She does not scramble to answer. She does not mirror the frenzy. Instead, she lets the moment breathe, her stillness radiating across the stage like a counterforce to the storm. For the audience watching at home, the contrast is startling. In the rhythm of debate television, silence is dangerous. Most fear it, rushing to fill the space with words before viewers can turn away. But Crockett wields silence differently, with the instinct of a trial lawyer who understands that the pause after a question can say more than the question itself. Kellyanne shifts, her hands clasping and unclasping, as though trying to grip control. "Well, don't you have something to say?" Jasmine lifts her gaze, her voice calm, steady, a whisper compared to the shouting that came before. "I've been listening." The simple reply lands like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread across the set. The host leans forward, intrigued. The audience, sensing a shift, falls into a hushed anticipation. Kellyanne forces a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. "Listening? Congresswoman, this isn't Sunday school. People are tuning in to hear answers." Jasmine folds her hands, her tone unhurried, deliberate. "Exactly, they want answers, not slogans, not recycled talking points, facts." The camera captures Kellyanne's eyes narrowing, her jaw tightening. The power dynamic has flipped in an instant. What began as Conway's stage has become Crockett's courtroom. The Congresswoman lets the silence expand again, a tactic that unsettles not only her opponent, but the entire production team scrambling behind the glass. On social media, viewers begin posting clips calling her composure lethal calm, a phrase that trends within minutes. Jasmine continues, her voice low, each word delivered with surgical precision. "When you talk about witch hunts, you're talking about accountability. When you talk about harassment, you're talking about oversight. The difference is, one serves the people, the other serves power." Kellyanne shifts again, fidgeting with her notes, but says nothing. For the first time, she is reacting rather than commanding. The host attempts to interject, sensing the tension. "Congresswoman Crockett, if I may." But Jasmine raises her, hand gently, not in defiance but with quiet authority. "I'll continue." The interruption dies immediately. Even the host, seasoned in the choreography of live debate, recognizes that control has shifted. Jasmine turns back toward Kellyanne, her voice soft but unyielding. "You've spent years perfecting the art of noise, and maybe that worked in 2016, when spin was mistaken for strength. But noise doesn't change truth. Anger doesn't erase facts." The words echo. Kellyanne opens her mouth, closes it, then finally snaps. "You think you're above it all? You think you can just sit there and act superior?" The Congresswoman doesn't flinch. She tilts her head slightly, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady. "I don't need to act superior. I only need to be consistent." A murmur runs through the live studio audience. The cameras catch Kellyanne's momentary falter, the blink, the tight clench of her jaw. Crockett presses on, not with volume but with clarity. The public isn't stupid. They see when someone is performing. They see when someone is spinning. And they also see when someone is telling the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable. Kellyanne slams her hand lightly on the desk. "Uncomfortable? Congresswoman, what you call uncomfortable, I call harassment." The sudden burst of sound only heightens the contrast. Jasmine remains motionless, her voice now carrying the weight of a closing argument. Then maybe the truth feels like harassment when you've built a career on avoiding it. The silence afterward is deafening. Viewers at home feel their breath catch. The host lowers his gaze, scribbling notes he will never read on air. Even the producers behind the glass exchange glances, aware they are witnessing a moment destined to reverberate far beyond this segment. Jasmine lets her pen tap once against the desk, then sets it aside. She looks directly into the camera, as though speaking not just to the panel but to the millions watching. "You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You only need to speak with purpose." The studio stills. The line, clipped and captioned within seconds, begins spreading online. Twitter timelines erupt. TikTok creators splice the quote into videos within minutes. Hashtags bloom. Kellyanne, for all her experience, suddenly seems small under the weight of Crockett's stillness. She adjusts her blazer, clears her throat, tries to regain footing. But the audience knows. The battle has shifted. For years, Kellyanne Conway thrived in chaos, bending it to her will. But tonight, chaos is her undoing. Jasmine Crockett has turned silence into a weapon, patience into dominance, and in doing so, she has reshaped the battlefield entirely. As the camera lingers on the two women, the contrast could not be sharper. One unraveling through noise, the other rising through composure. And in that contrast, a nation watching from living rooms and phone screens sees more than just a debate. They see a lesson unfolding in real time, that silence, when wielded with intent, can be louder than any shout. The silence has stretched long enough to unsettle Kellyanne, long enough for millions of viewers to register the shift. For years, Conway has thrived on relentless pace, never giving her opponents space to breathe. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett has flipped that script. And now, with the eyes of a nation locked on her, she decides it's time to move. Her tone sharpens, though she never raises her voice. You call it harassment, but let's remind the audience what you've called truth in the past. Kellyanne stiffens, wary. She knows what's coming, but the cameras offer no escape. Jasmine folds her hands on the desk. January of 2017. Your very first days in the White House. A reporter pressed you about the crowd size at the inauguration, and your response wasn't to admit a mistake. It was to coin a phrase, alternative facts. The words hang, heavy in the studio air. The audience remembers. Social media lights up, with users already posting clips of Conway's infamous defense of Sean Spicer's false claims. Jasmine leans in, her voice steady. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was the blueprint. Distract, deflect, distort. Turn truth into theater and theater into truth. It worked then, because the chaos was new. But after years of disinformation, from downplaying COVID to denying ethics violations, the American people have grown tired of the script. Kellyanne interrupts sharply, her voice bristling. That's rich, Congresswoman. Coming from a party that's been spinning lies about Russia, lies about elections, lies about everything under the sun. Don't stand there and pretend your hands are clean. Jasmine tilts her head, letting the accusation hang a moment before responding. I'm not pretending anything. But you don't get to bury one falsehood under another and call it even. That's not balance, that's deceit. The audience murmurs, the tension crackling. Even the host seems caught in the force of the exchange, his usual moderating presence muted. Jasmine presses further, her words precise, methodical, almost prosecutorial. The Office of Special Counsel found you guilty of violating the Hatch Act repeatedly by mixing official duties with political speech. Their report described your behavior as persistent, notorious, and deliberate. Those are not my words. Those are the words of a federal watchdog. Kellyanne's jaw tightens, but she forces a smile dismissive. The Hatch Act is a relic. It's selectively enforced. Everyone in Washington knows that. Jasmine's reply is calm but unyielding. Selective enforcement doesn't excuse repeated violations. Rules don't disappear because they inconvenience. Power. For the first time, Kellyanne glances toward the host as if seeking rescue, but the host merely looks down at his notes, unwilling to interrupt the duel that has taken center stage. Jasmine continues, her voice unwavering. You stood on television during a pandemic and minimized warnings from public health experts, dismissing the risks, undermining science. And you did so not as a private citizen, but as an official speaking for the White House. How many lives did that rhetoric touch? How many people chose denial over caution because those words came from you? Kellyanne's face reddens. That's an outrageous accusation. I never told anyone to ignore health. I simply reminded the American people not to panic. Jasmine's eyes fix on her, steady. Not to panic or not to question, because there's a difference. Leadership doesn't mean suppressing fear with fiction. It means confronting fear with honesty. The line slices through the air. The audience, silent moments before, exhales in a collective murmur. On Twitter, the quote takes off instantly. Leadership doesn't mean suppressing fear with fiction. It means confronting fear with honesty. Kellyanne shakes her head, trying to regain her footing. You're twisting my words. This is exactly what I mean. Democrats don't debate. They distort. Jasmine's expression doesn't change. She waits, then speaks slowly, each word deliberate. I don't need to twist your words. They've twisted themselves over years of contradiction. The room freezes. Kellyanne exhales sharply, her shoulders tightening, her frustration visible. For the first time in her long career of televised jousts, her rhythm falters not because she's been interrupted, but because her own history is being held up like a mirror. The Congresswoman leans forward slightly, her voice carrying not just across the stage but across the nation. This isn't about left versus right, it's about honesty versus distortion. It's about whether our democracy can survive if facts are treated like playthings for political gain. Kellyanne starts to respond, but her words falter, caught in the gravity of Crockett's argument. She swallows, forces a smile that looks more like a grimace. Jasmine finishes with a quiet force. You can call it harassment, you can call it bias, but the truth doesn't bend to names, and tonight the truth is watching. The studio is silent, almost reverent. Even the hum of the light seems louder in the absence of Kellyanne's once dominant voice. And at that moment, millions of viewers realize what has happened. The spin machine has been dismantled, piece by piece, not with volume, but with clarity. And Kellyanne Conway, once the architect of America's disinformation, now sits visibly shaken as her blueprint is read aloud in front of the nation she once manipulated. The lights of the studio seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the conflict. Producers in the control room whispered frantically into headsets, debating whether to cut to commercial, but the director shook his head. What was happening on stage wasn't chaos. It was history. To interrupt it would be a crime against television itself. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, her knuckles white against the polished desk. Her once controlled demeanor had crumbled into something jagged and raw. Her words no longer carried the polished cadence of a seasoned strategist. They spilled out in bursts, sharp and unfiltered. You stand there, she hissed, her voice trembling at the edge of rage, pretending to be the savior of democracy. But you're nothing more than a puppet of the left, a mouthpiece for their lies. You've built your entire career on outrage, and yet you dare accuse me of deceit? Gasps rippled through the live audience. Some clapped in approval, others shook their heads. The country, divided into red and blue, seemed to materialize in that room, breathing, arguing, ready to break apart. Jasmine Crockett sat still. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her stillness became its own kind of dominance. Every second she delayed her response tightened the tension, made Conway's words feel smaller, more desperate. Finally, Jasmine turned slightly, just enough to meet Conway's eyes with a steady gaze. Her voice, when it came, was deliberate, each syllable measured, heavy with certainty. You mistake volume for truth, Kellyanne. You mistake chaos for conviction. But the American people aren't fooled. They know when they're being sold. A circus. The audience stirred, a murmur passing through the crowd. Even through the television cameras, the moment carried a weight that reached into living rooms across the country. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about something deeper, the battle over reality itself. Kellyanne laughed, sharp and humorless. A circus? That's rich, coming from a party that spent years chasing phantoms, Russia, collusion, impeachment after impeachment. You don't want truth, Congresswoman. You want revenge. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned forward, her hands folding neatly on the desk as though she were preparing to deliver a closing argument in court. This isn't about revenge. This is about responsibility. You built an empire of excuses. Every scandal, every abuse of power you dressed in spin and called it patriotism. But spin doesn't save democracy, Kellyanne. Accountability does. And accountability has finally arrived. The audience erupted. Half in applause, half in outrage. The moderator tried to interject, his voice rising above the din, but his presence was shrinking by the second. This was no longer his show. It belonged entirely to the women who had turned debate into battle. Kellyanne's mask cracked further. Her face flushed as she pointed a trembling finger toward Crockett. You don't know what accountability is. You've never had to face the impossible, to stand in the fire while the entire world despises you. I fought to defend a president, yes. And you? You sit in your safe little seat in Congress and pretend you're fighting for justice. You wouldn't last a day in my shoes. Jasmine's lips curved, not in amusement but in recognition of the final desperate play of a cornered adversary. I don't envy your shoes, she replied calmly, because every step you took in them left this country weaker, angrier, more divided. You want to speak of fire? I was born in it. And I don't burn, I endure. A silence fell, heavier than applause, heavier than outrage. Even Conway, caught in her own unraveling, faltered for a moment. The weight of Crockett's words pressed down like judgment itself. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens. Twitter exploded in real time. Hashtags bearing both women's names trended at once. Digital battlegrounds echoing the very fight playing out on stage. Commentators, pundits, and citizens alike were already calling it the defining political confrontation of the year. The camera caught Conway as she inhaled sharply, blinking hard to steady herself. But it was too late. The veneer of untouchable strategist had been torn away, leaving something brittle in its place. Crockett, meanwhile, remained unshaken. She glanced briefly toward the moderator, then back to her opponent, her voice softer now but no less cutting. This isn't theater for me. This isn't about winning applause or headlines. This is about the truth. And the truth, Kellyanne, is that the era of spin is ending. The era of accountability has begun. The studio lights hummed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the set. The air itself seemed electric, as if the country's collective breath was caught in that suspended moment. The director's voice crackled through the control room. Don't cut. Stay with it. We're watching history. And in that stillness, in the charged silence before the storm moved forward, the nation understood. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. The studio lights glared hotter now, as though even the ceiling had grown restless under the tension. The moderator, a veteran of Sunday morning shows who prided himself on keeping order, shuffled his cards nervously. His crisp smile, polished through decades of controlled interviews, faltered with every passing second as the clash between Jasmine Crockett and Kellyanne Conway grew sharper, louder, more unpredictable. He cleared his throat. Let's return to the question of institutional trust, he began, his voice cracking faintly. But neither woman turned her gaze toward him. The air was no longer his to command. Kellyanne leaned forward, jabbing a manicured finger toward Crockett. You are part of a political machine that's obsessed with tearing down everything conservatives built. You call it accountability. I call it vengeance. Her voice carried a desperate edge now, layered with the cadence of someone used to spinning narratives but beginning to lose control of the wheel. The moderator raised a hand as if to insert himself, but Jasmine spoke before he could. Her tone was low, deliberate. Vengeance is loud, she said. But justice? Justice is quiet until it's undeniable. The room stilled. Even the whir of a camera crane above seemed to pause, caught in the gravity of her words. The moderator forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ladies, if we could... But Kellyanne's voice rose, cutting through his attempt. Don't you dare patronize me with those rehearsed little lines. I've stood in the West Wing, I've defended presidents, and you... She gestured with an open palm toward Crockett, her tone dripping with contempt. You're a first-term Congresswoman who thinks throwing shade on cable TV makes her a stateswoman. Gasps rippled faintly through the live audience. The moderator stiffened, shuffling his cards with unnecessary force as if the sound of paper might restore control. But Crockett didn't react with anger. She let the insult hang in the air, the silence stretching, amplifying. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the growing chaos. Power without integrity collapses under its own weight, Kellyanne. You stood in the West Wing and sold half-truths until even truth forgot what it looked like. Don't confuse proximity to power with possessing it. The moderator blinked, his hand halfway raised again. He was a conductor waving a baton in front of an orchestra that no longer needed him. The debate had transformed into something raw, unscripted. A duel where centuries of rhetoric and manipulation collided with a fresh insistence on clarity. His producer's voice crackled in his earpiece. Control it. Get it back. But how? Every attempt he made to steer the conversation only reminded the audience of how little sway he now held. Each time he opened his mouth, the women ignored him, their clash pulling the spotlight further from his grasp. Kellyanne's tone sharpened. People like you are tearing this country apart. You call yourself principled, but you'll trample anyone who disagrees with you, so long as the cameras are rolling. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, her expression unreadable. The cameras aren't my judge. The people are, and they deserve leaders who answer questions instead of rewriting them mid-sentence. The moderator tried again, voice rising with forced authority. Congresswoman Crockett, Ms. Conway, we must move on. But his plea was drowned by the tension swelling like a storm front. Kellyanne slammed her palm on the desk. The sound echoed, startling some in the audience. You think you're so composed, so righteous, but all you're doing is exploiting division. That's your brand. Outrage disguised as ethics. Jasmine leaned back this time, folding her hands calmly, a gesture that contrasted with Kellyanne's fury. Outrage, she said softly, is what people feel when they've been lied to for too long. The moderator pressed his lips together, his face betraying the panic of a man watching his authority dissolve in front of millions. His voice had lost its confidence. I really must ask you both. But no one was listening. The duel had become the show, eclipsing the very man meant to guide it. Viewers at home no longer noticed the moderator's words. They watched only the fire in Conway's eyes and the unshakable steadiness in Crockett's. They weren't watching a debate. They were watching a reckoning. And somewhere in the control room, producers realized the truth. The moderator had become invisible. His attempts to pull the reins had only underscored that the horses were running wild, and the audience loved it. By the time the segment was halfway through, the moderator had stopped raising his hand. He sat with a fixed smile, nodding mechanically, trapped between the need to appear in control and the realization that control was gone. The debate was no longer his. It belonged to them. And as Kellyanne's voice climbed higher and Crockett's answers grew sharper, it became clear. America wasn't just watching the collapse of one man's authority. They were watching the old choreography of politics crumble live on stage, replaced by something raw, uncontainable, and real. The city had begun to sweat under the weight of its own divisions. By the time Jasmine Crockett walked into the Capitol hearing chamber, the air felt heavier than the stone walls around her. The chamber was lined with flashing cameras, microphones like bayonets, and the faint buzz of whispered speculation. Every seat was filled, every eye intent. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was theater. Democracy's most fragile stage. Kellyanne Conway was already seated at the witness table, her posture rigid, her hair perfectly in place, the trademark steeliness in her eyes barely concealing the storm beneath. She scanned the room with an expression somewhere between defiance and exhaustion. She had lived through countless interrogations of public opinion, but today felt different. Today, the opponent wasn't just a hostile press corps or a skeptical public. Today, it was Jasmine. The gavel struck. A hush rippled through the chamber. Jasmine rose slowly, every movement deliberate, her body language carrying the weight of history behind her. The moment demanded presence, not performance, and she seemed to know it instinctively. Her hand grazed the wooden desk before her, as if grounding herself in the gravity of what she was about to do. Ms. Conway, Jasmine began, her tone calm, but edged with steel. We are here not to rehearse slogans, not to entertain partisanship, but to answer a question Americans have been asking for too long. What happens when truth is treated like an accessory instead of a principle? Kellyanne's lips tightened. Congresswoman, she replied, her voice rehearsed. What you call slogans are actually the concerns of millions of Americans who felt abandoned by institutions like this one. My role was to give voice to those concerns. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. Your role was to give voice, yes, but when that voice twisted facts into shadows, when it blurred the line between truth and manipulation, did you ever consider that you weren't giving voice, Ms. Conway? You were stealing clarity. The chamber reacted with a soft stir. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Kellyanne shifted in her chair, her defenses rising. You speak as though I created division. Division was already there. I didn't invent mistrust, I reflected it. Isn't that the job of anyone serving a president? To reflect his vision, to defend it? Jasmine's voice dropped almost to a whisper, yet somehow it carried across the entire room. Defending a vision is not the same as distorting reality. And when the defense becomes distortion, when half-truths are weaponized, the damage isn't just political, it's generational. Children inherit a broken compass. For a moment, silence. The kind of silence that feels electric, as though every person in the chamber was afraid to breathe too loudly. Kellyanne's composure wavered, just for a second. She shifted her papers, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Congresswoman, it's easy to sit there with righteous words. You weren't in the room when the pressure mounted, when the demands were unrelenting, when loyalty wasn't a choice but a survival mechanism. Jasmine stepped closer, not as an accuser but as a witness to something larger. Her gaze locked on Kellyanne, sharp and unblinking. Then say it plainly. Say it to the American people watching tonight. Loyalty to power came before loyalty to truth. Is that what you want history to record? The question hung in the air like a verdict waiting to fall. Kellyanne opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her jaw clenched, her eyes darted toward the cameras, then back to Jasmine. For the first time, she looked cornered not by politics, but by her own reflection. The gavel struck again. The chair of the committee reminded the chamber of decorum, but the room already knew the hearing had shifted. This wasn't simply a clash of testimony anymore. It was a reckoning. Narration swelled over the chamber's tension, as though the walls themselves could remember. This was the moment truth demanded a witness, and history refused to let go. Outside, crowds pressed against barriers, some chanting Jasmine's name, others holding placards defending Kellyanne, voices colliding into an anthem of division. America wasn't just watching. America was deciding, through every word, every pause, every crack in Kellyanne's resolve, what kind of future it wanted to inherit. Jasmine finally broke the silence, her voice lower now, not for cameras, but for the soul across from her. I don't want you to confess to me, Ms. Conway. I want you to confess to yourself, because until you do, this country will never heal. Kellyanne's eyes glistened, though she blinked the moment away with practiced restraint. She sat back, crossing her arms as though rebuilding her armor. But the audience had already seen the fracture. The gavel struck once more. The chair called a recess. Reporters surged toward the exits, their voices spilling into the corridors, headlines forming before ink ever touched paper. And in the center of it all, Jasmine and Kellyanne remained motionless, two women bound not just by conflict, but by the burden of what it meant to carry truth, one to protect it, the other to face it. The chamber emptied slowly, but the echo lingered. It was the sound of a nation at its tipping point. The hearing room was hushed, as though every person had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Outside the chamber walls, the city pulsed with its usual chaos. Horns, sirens, hurried footsteps echoing across marble. But here, time seemed to slow. Kellyanne Conway adjusted her blazer, her hands betraying a faint tremor. Jasmine Crockett, seated directly across, exuded an unsettling calm. She didn't lean forward, didn't fidget, didn't even shift her gaze. She simply waited, as though she knew the weight of patience could suffocate louder than accusation. The moderator, an older man with thinning hair and the weary patience of someone who had mediated too many partisan battles, cleared his throat. "We'll move to closing remarks before public testimony begins." His voice carried no emotion, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. He wanted an ending, yet in this room, nothing was close to ending. Kellyanne seized the invitation. Her words rushed, like a flood against a brittle dam. "What we are seeing here is not accountability. It's not transparency. It is persecution, a relentless campaign against those who dared to serve this country under President Trump. You can dress it up with legal jargon, call it oversight, but the truth is plain. This is political theater. This is vengeance." She raised her hand as if conducting an orchestra, her words sharp, slicing the air. And Congresswoman Crockett is leading that theater. She has no interest in fairness. She has interest in power. You want to criminalize strategy. You want to weaponize process. But history will not be kind to those who destroy institutions under the guise of saving them. The outburst crackled like static in the charged silence. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the flicker in Kellyanne's eyes, the way her lips tightened after the last word, as though even she knew her argument was clinging to crumbling scaffolding. "Jasmine, let the silence stretch." She leaned back, almost leisurely, hands folded on the table as if the stakes were trivial compared to the truth she carried. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and sharp enough to cut through marble. "You talk about persecution," she said. "But persecution is being jailed for speaking truth in a dictatorship. Persecution is having no voice, no vote, no power to challenge the leaders who control your life. What we are doing here, this messy, public, imperfect process, is democracy. You can call it theater if you like, but theater has an audience that can leave when it chooses. Democracy does not allow that. It demands that we stay, that we watch, that we account for what we've done." Kellyanne shifted, opening her mouth, but Jasmine raised a hand slightly, not rudely but firmly, a gesture that conveyed ownership of the floor. "And history," Jasmine continued, "will not be written by those who shout loudest. It will be written by those who faced the noise and still spoke truth. You can call me partisan, you can call me theatrical, but what you cannot call me is silent." The audience reacted in ripples, a soft gasp, a murmur that spread across the chamber like a wind moving through tall grass. Journalists scribbled furiously. The moderator blinked, his pen pausing mid-note. Kellyanne laughed, a brittle sound that cracked under the weight of the moment. "You think clever words win battles, Congresswoman? You think sound bites will save the country? What you call democracy is selective justice. You target one side and let the other run free. That is not truth. That is tyranny dressed up as virtue." Jasmine tilted her head, her eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in something colder. Certainty. Selective justice is a system where the wealthy buy their way out while the poor rot in cells. Selective justice is when lies become policy and truth becomes punished. If you see yourself in that description, Ms. Conway, then perhaps the mirror you fear is already in front of you. The chamber erupted, not in shouts, but in the sharp inhale of 100 witnesses, recognizing the gravity of a blow landed without raising a voice.